oi, oi. Ah, that's just the elf complaining. Ignore her, that's what I do. Oh, that's got a kick. We march like thunder on the hills to right the wrongs of old. Oi, oi!
My blood cries out for the vengeance of my people's blood, which can only be repaid with at least twice as much blood, or maybe 3 times as much blood. Like if you went to hell, and it was full of blood, and that blood was on fire, and it was raining blood, and maybe that would be enough blood. But probably not.
Down it goes!
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another melee mastery mechanics guide, this time covering the Dwarf of Doom, the Senpai of Slaying, the Lord of Lumberjacking, the beast that is Bardin. And I mean, you gotta hand it to him, because he obviously can't reach. Dwarf joke number 1, score! I know guys, but I had to do a short dwarf joke. And he scores! 2-0! Sorry guys, I really didn't mean to stoop to that level. It's a hat trick! Oh, I think that's enough of that. I promise. I'll rise above it now. Score! As always, we're gonna go through each of Bardin's melee weapons one by one, discussing and showcasing their optimal attack sequences in relation to different specific enemy spawns. One-handed hammer, also pirate dwarf. And I just want to give a quick shout out to I Am Lupo and Philip the Destroyer for helping me out by bringing back one of my favorite mods, which was unfortunately broken in Winds of Magic. And it basically allows me to customize the weapon color of any weapon. I'll throw a link to it in the description, but keep in mind this only works on the modded realm. As always, we're going to start off with some of the simpler weapons and slowly move our way up the ladder of complexity, but there's plenty to go through, so without further ado, let's get started. First try, and because this is a video, there's nothing you can do to prove me wrong. Now, as for the one-handed hammer, whenever you're fighting hordes, you're going to be using a simple combo of push-block attack into a double light attack, and there will be minion spawns behind the dummies for the upcoming weapons, but I had some weird glitches, and basically I accidentally despawned all of the minions, and it takes a long time to spawn them correctly, so I thought it wasn't worth the bother just for this 1 or 2 weapons that are missing. Now, as for the unarmored elites, more often than not, especially versus berserkers, you're going to be using your heavy attacks to headshot. However, whenever you're fighting a chaos raider, you're going to be using your light attack sequence. And in case you're not sure what a chaos raider is, I'll showcase it on the next weapon, but it's basically the minions that have a heavily armored head. And for those minions specifically, you want to be using your light attack sequence since you don't want to be headshotting them. Now, as for the armored elites, as you probably guessed, you're simply going to be using your heavy attack sequence, since the only other attack you have that deals any armor damage is your 4th light attack, and it deals nearly identical damage to your heavy attack sequence. So there's really no value to be obtained here, so it's much easier to just use your heavy attacks, which also provide easy headshots. One-handed axe is new body spray for dwarves. Varieties include, but are not limited to, salted pork, the smell of pure gold, and essence of concentrated beard. And clearly I'm running out of jokes. But anyways, the one-handed axe is pretty damn simple. It's identical to Soulspire's one-handed axe, both in terms of damage and attack sequences. But as you can see here, I did in fact spawn a bunch of minions and a bunch of other stuff, simply to create a better and more relaxing atmosphere for you guys to look at. But in terms of the one-handed axe, whenever you're fighting trash minions, you're simply going to be using your light attack sequence and preferably throwing in a push here and there in order to stagger the minions, especially versus higher minion densities. As for the unarmored elites, and you can see the raiders in the back, those are the ones I mentioned earlier. Now, quite often, as with many weapons, you're going to be initiating with your heavy attack sequence here in order to get an easy headshot, but in terms of damage over time, your light attack sequence is preferable. But as I mentioned, you don't want to be headshotting the raiders, so keep that in mind. As for the armored elites, it really depends on whether or not you see a headshot opportunity, so you can often initiate with your heavy attack sequence and then follow it up with your light attack sequence, as it deals equal armor damage per attack. So since you attack faster with your light attacks, that is preferable, but anyways, it's not rocket science, so let's move on. Dual double-wield-handed hammers, or something. Close enough. Now this is the first weapon where there's really something to talk about. Now there are two key things to notice about the dual wield hammers, the first and most important of which is the fourth light attack. It's a high DPS low cleave attack, which as you can see deals an insane amount of damage, but in fact does not appear as the fourth attack in the light attack sequence. But we'll cover that in more detail once we get to the armored minions. The second thing I want you to notice is the difference between the first heavy attack and the second and third heavy attack. The first being an overhead attack and the second and third having extremely high cleave and stagger modifiers. Now as you're about to see when we're spamming the light attack sequence, with the exception of critical hits, none of the attacks actually deal a significant amount of damage more than any of the other attacks, meaning the fourth light attack does not appear when you're simply spamming your light attacks, which is what you're going to be doing most of the time whenever you're fighting trash minions. If however you're fighting a mixed pool of enemies, you can resort to your heavy attack sequence, using the first heavy attack to target specific minions in the pool in order to headshot an elite, and then using the second and third heavy attack as they provide the highest amount of cleave and stagger, and that's especially important versus super high minion densities. Now one thing I forgot to showcase which is super important is one light attack into a double heavy attack, which essentially skips the overhead attack, allowing you to focus on the heavy cleave and stagger attacks. Now as for the unarmored elites, you have a couple of options available depending on which minion you're fighting. Assuming it's not a raider, one option is to do your first heavy attack, doing a block cancel and repeating the sequence, which is great for doing well-timed attacks on charging berserkers. However, your highest DPS output is still gonna be your light attack sequence. And if you're fighting multiple berserkers or just a very mixed pool of enemies, you definitely want to go for your heavy attack 2 and 3 as they provide the highest amount of cleave and stagger. Now, before moving on to the armored elites, I want to talk about the fourth light attack in the sequence that I mentioned at the beginning of the dual wield hammers, that isn't actually part of your light attack sequence. Now, the way to actually trigger this attack is by doing your push block attack into a light attack. As you can see here, the damage output from this light attack is significantly higher than just a regular light attack. Now I'm gonna clear out the chat here and just spam my light attack sequence, and as you can see, neither of these attacks deal any armor damage at all, even though the armory clearly states that light attack 4 deals 9.25 armor damage. And yet no matter how much you spam, this attack does not appear in the sequence. However, as mentioned earlier, you simply need to do a push block attack into your light attack in order to trigger this fourth light attack, which as an added bonus happens to also be an overhead attack. However, keep in mind that all of the damage numbers listed in the armory don't take into account that the heavy attacks are double attacks, meaning you use 2 hammers. In other words, their actual damage output is twice the listed number assuming you hit with both weapons, which when taken into account means the fourth light attack isn't necessarily significant enough to actually build your entire attack sequence around, but more of an extra tool that should be utilized whenever you are doing a push and you aren't exclusively fighting trash minions. You definitely want to incorporate it into your sequence in order to obtain the maximum value. Or you could just go dual wield lumberjacking, because looking badass is more important than winning. Okay, maybe it isn't, but it's gotta count for something. Now the only real thing to notice here is what isn't there, which is cleave and stagger. Oh yeah, and of course, stamina. It only has 2 stamina, even though the one-handed axe has 3 stamina, and the dual wield hammers has 4 stamina. But who needs stamina when you can lumberjack stuff to death? I mean, you can basically double the speed of deforestation, at least assuming the trees were really close to one another. Guys, I'm clearly running out of jokes, but there's just not as much to say about the dual wield axes as I wish there were. Because here's the thing, you can only use them on the Slayer, and the Slayer always has 2 sets of melee weapons equipped. So even if you are fighting a horde with the dual wield axes, you're very rarely ever going to be using them to fight an actual horde, unless you're dual wielding axes, in which case you're a fucking badass, but you're also fucking retarded. And I mean, I can respect that. But I don't think your team is gonna love you. And you know, maybe it's just me, but it just doesn't feel as badass once you realize that 5 clan rats mixed in together with the elites is your version of kryptonite. Now, as for the unarmored elites, as with so many other weapons, your light attack sequence provides the highest amount of infantry damage, and you're pretty much just gonna be spamming your light attacks. You might initiate with a push block attack, which is preferable over using your heavy attack sequence, since your push block attack provides a double overhead attack, which is really useful assuming you're not fighting a raider. This is the same thing you're gonna be doing against armored elites, and it's pretty much the only real trick there is to using the dual wield axes. Now, preferably you want to make sure ahead of time that you reach some sort of breakpoint, allowing a double headshot from your push block attack to one-shot something like a storm vermin when hitting with both blades. Although you want to keep a close tab on your stamina since you don't have a lot to spare, and besides that you're pretty much just gonna be spamming left click. It's hammer time! Great hammer time! Guys, I think we have a serious problem. I'm running short on funny things to say. Running short! Get it? Oh my god, kill yourself, Michael. Oh, and by the way, I'm Michael. Nice to meet you. Wait, where was I? Oh yeah, great hammer. It has 2 attacks. A light attack and a heavy attack. And a fairly useless push block attack. And it is in fact entirely identical to Kruber's great hammer in terms of both its attack sequence and its damage output. And guys, just in case it sounds like I'm blurping out random stuff that has absolutely no relation to the actual context of the video, it's a total coincidence and you can forget about it because I'm at the dummy now. And whenever you're fighting trash minions, regardless of the density, you are always gonna be using your heavy attack sequence. There's really no hocus pocus here, and the only real trick you can use other than putting in a push here and there comes in the form of swaying your camera from side to side, as I am totally not doing here, since this is something I recalled in hindsight as I was recording these voice clips, and I apologize that this video comes across as slightly more messy than my other melee mechanics guides. I promise you I have done both testing and research prior to the recording, but at a measly 30 plus 100, Bardin is by far my least played hero. However, the Great Hammer is one of the weapons I use the most on Bardin, and versus unarmored elites you want to use a double light attack, do a block cancel and repeat that sequence if you want to do the highest single target damage output. However, when you are fighting multiple elites at the same time, you're more often than not gonna be forced to use your heavy attack sequence. Now, once upon a time, which is like maybe a month ago or something, this weapon was absolutely motherfucking broken due to a mechanic known as swap cancelling. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your preferences I guess, they recently nerfed this quite hard in relation to the two-handed hammer, and I can only speak from my own personal experience, but I would argue to such an extent that it's barely worth the effort anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, it does increase the speed at which you can spam your light attacks, but under the assumption that you're not resorting to using macros, the amount of effort required hardly seems worth the potential rewards when you just compare it to simply doing 2 light attacks, doing a block cancel, and then doing 2 more light attacks. And don't get me wrong here, I'm not one to often recommend comfort over effort, but doing proper swap cancelling requires a lot of input spamming. So unless there's some trick of which I am not aware to circumvent the recent patch notes, I don't personally feel like it's worth it, but I would suggest trying either and making up your own mind, and in case you hadn't figured it out yet, you want to use your light attacks for single target armor damage and swap to your heavy attack sequence whenever shit really hits the fan. The Great Axe. And at this point you've probably realized that Bardin really only has 3 different weapons. Hammers, axes, and I mean that's even being generous. Let's be real, the pickaxe is really just a combination of a hammer and an axe. In other words, every single weapon he has is just some sort of variation of size, number, or combination of hammers and axes. Now, in a lot of ways, the Great Axe is very similar to the Great Hammer, but there's a reason you mostly see people using the Great Hammer, and that's because this is basically a slightly less versatile version of the same weapon. It has less cleave, less stagger, and a slightly faster attack sequence. Now, whenever you're fighting hordes or large amounts of infantry minions, you really have 2 options. You can either do a push block attack into a double light attack versus low density hordes, or you can do a double heavy attack into a light attack versus high density hordes. Another way you could approach it is to say that you're gonna initiate with your push block attack into a double light attack until you proc your swift slaying. Once you proc your swift slaying, you definitely want to switch over to the double heavy into a single light attack, since of the 2, this is the superior sequence in terms of cleave, but if you're already surrounded by minions, you might not have the luxury of being able to charge up your heavy attack, which is why I suggest mastering both sequences, as this gives you a more versatile approach. Now, versus the unarmored elites, it's pretty damn straightforward. It's fairly similar in this regard to the two-handed hammer. You're gonna be using your light attack sequence, but just like with the Great Hammer, you're gonna be cutting it short after the first 2 light attacks, using a block cancel in order to reset the sequence, as you continue to just lumberjack stuff in the face. Now, in similar fashion to the two-handed hammer, whenever you're dealing with multiple elites or a mixed pool of enemies, you can resort to using your heavy attack sequence. However, the issue here is that your heavy attacks don't have the same amount of cleave and stagger as they do on the Great Hammer. But if you have to do it, you want to use the same sequence we used against the Horde, which is a double heavy into a single light attack. And boring as it may seem, you're pretty much going to be treating armored elites exactly the same way. Now, the exact same patch that nerfed the Great Hammer actually gave a very slight buff to the Great Axe, But even so, I feel like this is a very similar case to that of the Great Hammer, and if you want to bother, then you can in fact increase your attack speed by doing a swap cancel, but whether or not that's actually worth the effort, I'll leave for you guys to decide down in the comments below. But before we move on to the shielded weapons, we're just gonna take a quick detour in order to explain something regarding the shield bash, cause as you guys rightfully pointed out in my Kruber melee mechanics video, the armory doesn't really provide an accurate description of the shield bash. Now this attack is identical on both Kruber's and Bardin's shielded weapons, and as you can see, they all list 4.24, cleave and stagger. But what the armory fails to mention is the fact that how many minions you can actually hit with the shield bash is only determined by the actual minion density. As you can clearly see here, it doesn't matter how many storm vermins there are, the shield bash is gonna stagger every single minion that the attack animation collides with. In other words, it has a sort of infinite stagger cleave, assuming that makes any sense. And with that little caveat out of the way, let's move on. The final variation, Hammer and Shield, which oddly enough has an identical light attack sequence to the one-handed hammer, although be it with a slightly slower attack animation, aka lower attack speed. It does however have a completely different heavy 1 attack, which has quite amazing cleave and stagger and is absolutely key to using the hammer and shield properly. Now do note that the push block attack is the only other attack that has any armor damage. Now when you're fighting hordes with the hammer and shield, you actually have multiple different options. The first is doing a push into a double light attack and then repeating that sequence. This takes advantage of the highly efficient push that you have with shielded weapons, staggering the minions before initiating your light attack sequence. However, if for whatever reason this proves insufficient, or if you're simply fighting a highly mixed pool of enemies, you want to sequence in your first heavy attack for a varied source of damage, using your shield bash as a source of crowd control, as well as an efficient way to generate temporary HP. Last but not least, in case you're in a kinky mood, you can always spam your heavy 1 attack, do a push block cancel, and repeating that sequence. Although I want to stress the fact that I am playing on the Slayer at the moment, which is gonna give me a higher attack speed, and the reason I haven't swapped over to the Iron Breaker is simply so I don't have to reset the entire scene. So don't get frustrated if you aren't able to repeat some of the sequences as fast as I'm doing it now. In retrospect, I should have probably thought of that before I started recording, but that's what happens when you make me do a Bardin video. Now, in terms of the unarmored elites, as with pretty much every single other weapon in the game, your light attacks are what deals the highest amount of infantry damage. But honestly, whenever you're using the hammer and shield, more often than not, your focus is gonna be on staggering or tanking the army of berserkers, not killing it. So get that shield bash out as much as you possibly can. And again, if you're fighting a mixed pool of enemies, use your heavy 1 attack, otherwise simply use your light attack sequence here. Now, as for the armored elites, you're pretty much just gonna be spamming your push block attack as much as possible. Although if you are fighting a varied pool of enemies, you definitely want to remember to use your heavy 1 attack as well as your shield bash in between. But in terms of effectively eliminating single target armored enemies, push block attack, push block attack, push block attack, push block attack. And once you're done push block attacking, guess what? Push block attack! Yay! The complexity is astounding. I mean, I'm not sure how you're gonna remember that entire sequence all by yourself, but next! Axe and Shield. No funny weapon names, you can only make so many hammer and axe jokes before it starts being seriously repetitive, said the guy who initiated the video with 4 dwarf jokes in a row. But while we're all pretending like that never happened, let's move on to the axe and shield, which basically has an identical light attack sequence to the axe. It's surprising, I know. Now, unlike the hammer and shield, with the axe you're initiating your heavy attack sequence with the shield bash, which allows you to do a sequence of pure stagger, which is basically a push into a heavy attack and then repeating the sequence, which I've been told by better Bardin players than myself is super useful, and by far the quickest way to generate temporary HP with the axe and shield. Now, since your light attacks have absolutely zero cleave and stagger, you're gonna be using your heavy attack sequence, initiating with your shield bash, following it up by a heavy attack, and then resetting the sequence by doing a push. This sequence allows you to stagger a large amount of enemies, generate temp HP, and utilize your heavy attack 3, which is the only attack in your sequence which has any significant cleave damage. If however you're fighting a bunch of spread out and low density infantry minions, sequencing together one light attack and then one heavy attack is gonna utilize that same heavy attack. allowing you to dish out a slightly quicker and more direct form of DPS, which is a lot more practical if you're trying to clear up multiple spread out infantry minions. Now as for the unarmored elites, again you're not the DPS, but what you are going to do in case you need to fight them is start out by initiating with your shield bash, and in terms of pure infantry damage you're simply going to be spamming your light attack sequence, which you hopefully already figured out since there's a quite recurring pattern that you've hopefully started to notice by now. And if not, then I'm afraid I can't help you. Now, as for the armored elites, it's not all that different. You're pretty much going to be initiating with your shield bash as always in order to stagger as many minions as possible, and follow that up by your light attack sequence since this also has the highest amount of armor damage. If however you're fighting a highly mixed pool of enemies, consider reverting to the initial sequence of doing a double heavy into a push in order to reset the sequence. Now, last but not least, the weak point of any shield is being targeted from behind. And with either of Bardin's shielded weapons you have an effective push block angle of 180 degrees and extremely efficient block cost modifiers, but that only goes inside the effective push block angle, and any attack that you block from behind is gonna have the exact same stamina cost as with any other weapon, which means getting surrounded is your Achilles heel. And I've been told by iron breakers that break more iron than me that if you're ever completely surrounded, a really good trick is to push straight down into the ground, as this potentially allows you a near 360 degree effective push. And just in case I missed something, overlooked something, or misunderstood something, especially in relation to the shielded weapons, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below so I can pin any corrections as soon as possible. And last but not least, the Nut Hammer Nut Axe Gold Miner 3000. Better known as the War Pick, and probably the most interesting weapon in Bardin's arsenal. Maybe not the best, but definitely the most badass. Now the first thing you're gonna notice is that it has an extra charge on its heavy attacks, and that its fully charged heavy attacks deals an insane amount of armor damage. And although I haven't tested it on Cataclysm, at least on Legend I know with this Slayer you can do a meta build where you get the talent where you do 150% damage while mid-air, and you can actually one-shot Chaos Warriors if you do a fully charged heavy attack and hit the Chaos Warriors mid-air. Now this is not a good build by any standards, but it's a fucking hilarious build, and it's a fucking badass build. Now, as for fighting hordes and trash minions, you can either just spam your light attack sequence, or you can in fact, if you're playing on the Slayer, finally make use of the weapon swap animation cancel. And prior to making this video, I was actually not aware just to how great effect this could be used on the Pickaxe, which really makes pretty good sense when you think about it. I mean, how often do you just decide to get a double war pick like a fucking badass? I mean, you might do that now, but it's not at all obvious. And is it a meta build? For sure it's a meta build. But, I mean, who cares? You're gonna look fucking badass. I mean, just look at that attack speed, and with 22 stagger per attack, I mean, this probably isn't the way of viability on the Slayer, but I'm pretty sure I've made do with worse builds than this. And I think we can all agree, looking badass has to count for something when you're playing the Slayer. I mean, otherwise why the fuck are you playing the Slayer? It's not like he's the most viable of all classes, but when he works, he is goddamn fucking hilarious to play. Hack and slash! But yeah, anyways, whenever you're not fighting trash minions, you're pretty much just gonna be using your fully charged heavy attack, and probably you're gonna hit people in the face, and then people are going to die. And if they don't, then I don't know what you're doing. The Warpick has the highest single damage output of any melee weapon in the game, as well as a super satisfying train mechanic whenever you release the heavy attack, allowing you to rush forward, hit stuff in the face, and swiftly move back. Or better yet, charge your heavy attack, release your ulti, and freaking one-shot a Chaos Warrior mid-air. If that's not what Slayer's made for, then I don't give a shit what he's made for, okay? But anyways, that's all I had for you guys this time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I apologize for the extra cheesy episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know down in the comments below if you have any suggestions or possibly potentially corrections. And again, don't get me wrong, it's not that I haven't done my research, but it kind of feels awkward to teach someone else an attack sequence that you aren't actually used to using yourself, if that makes sense, even if you're certain that it's the right attack sequence. Something about it still feels potentially wrong, which is only the case for a couple of the weapons, but nonetheless, let me know down in the comments if I screwed something up. And as always, I love you guys, stay awesome, peace out!